The stone that the builders rejected has become the keystone. It's a mimetic theory of religion. In order to be a good anthropologist, what do you have to say and to see? Is that the myth, they have all something in common, which is that they read that story from the point of view of the mob. Christianity and Judaism before, they all interpret the story from the point of view of the victim. It's to tell the truth. It's the mob that is wrong. It's the crowd. It's the people who are wrong. That's why Christianity is hated in our world.
Well, greetings and welcome to this, my latest upload of Tough Minds, Tender Hearts and Steady Hands. And I've got three people who exemplify that today, and a real treat. They cover a wide and large spectrum of adult age span from the 20s to the 80s. Can I ask each of you quickly just to introduce yourself, give us your name, where you are presently on the planet, and what you do for a living? And maybe to start with you, Luke.
Okay, I'm Luke Hoebeke. I am talking from Leuven in Belgium. What I'm doing for a living, I'm enjoying living, because that's the definition of being retired. One thing I want to point out, I'm very grateful to you and surely to Johnathan, because he obliged me to reread the works of Girard that I have at home, and I reread them, and I have read them in a completely different way than about 45 years ago.
Rebekah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Rebekah Berndt. I am in South Carolina, near Charleston, South Carolina. I have been a critical care nurse for many years, and I've also been an organizer in various kind of faith and social justice spaces. And then, did I say I've been a nurse? I said I was a critical care nurse, and currently I'm a writer and spiritual director.
Thank you. Johnathan.
Yeah, hey, Johnathan. I'm talking from Manhattan right now on the Upper West Side. I've basically been building a fintech startup for the last 3 to 4 years. Yeah, so that's what I've been. That's my main occupation.
Well, to frame this, I've titled this Rene Girard, Comfort to Witness Bearers. Now, I'm going to ask Johnathan to introduce Rene Girard because he spent the last couple of years doing a really deep dive into the man and his thinking. But so let me just contextualize what he will say by first explaining why I've titled this Comfort to Witness Bearers. And as a visual aid, you can see on either side on my shoulder, there are piles of books. Now, I live in South Africa, and just look at the titles of these books on my right-hand side, because now, where we are, and 8 years after Justice Malala's book, we've had a commission of inquiry into state capture, the disclosure of massive corruption and wrongdoing, and I'd hoped that we were now taking off again. Now, thanks to the pile of books on my left, we are, because these are people that have testified to an extraordinary resolve not to succumb to this bleak situation. Those books have really been such an inspiration to me, and more people have come to want to blow the whistle, want to speak truth to power, only to find themselves retaliated against because there's a systemic culture that's developed whereby the truth about power is that it seems to wanting to be self-preserving. And then somebody mentioned that whistleblowers get scapegoated. And I thought, the scapegoat mechanism. Now, Johnathan is going to explain what is meant by that. And then after Johnathan's explained that, his experience and what he's done over the last number of years, invite Luke and Rebekah to tell us what they have learned and are still learning, so that I can offer comfort to witness bearers. Johnathan, what got you into Rene Girard, and what was it about him that you think is so compelling?
Yeah. Well, first thing I'll say is that I know very little about South Africa, but to your point of the introductory email, maybe that's a good thing, coming to see it with a bit of fresh eyes, as well as obviously for my own edification. So I got into Girard, I think, from quite a different angle than everyone else on this call, it seems. It seems that people got into Girard on this call due to social work, social justice, a concern for society. For me, the reason was much more selfish. It was a fundamental existential concern, and I got into Girard through his psychology. So I was a student in an elite computer science program. I had dropped out to run a startup. This was when I was a freshman. And that was because dropping out was all the rage back in the day, right? There's Zuckerberg, there's Gates, and in many elite computer science programs in America, dropping out is the prestigious and cool thing. The trick and the irony there is that it's disguised as this contrarian rebellion, right? Because you're leaving the system. But there's been so many mimetic models, so to speak, who have dropped out, that I would wager that in many elite computer science programs, that dropping out is the conformist path that's disguised under this banner of individuality. And so I unfortunately fell for that trap. And as a result, because my motivations to build the company were not fundamentally aligned with company building itself, the company crashed and burned. Now, two things were fortunate. One was that it crashed and burned very quickly, so I didn't waste that much time. I went immediately back to school. And second, that failure made me want to figure out what had happened, because clearly it wasn't just an external error, right? Like I really wanted this thing. It was a wholesome desire, and then I failed to get it due to external roadblocks. But it was very much my own desires that were the cause of the problem. And so I very much got into maybe three strands of thinkers. One is Girard, one is Buddhism, and the other is 19th and 20th century continental philosophy, specifically a lineage that could be called the recognition theorists. And so what Girard spoke to me and how he pulled me in was through his psychology. And it was his ways of articulating how humans are really social creatures that really helped me elucidate and illuminate my own struggles. And here's how I would frame it in a more historical context. I think people grow up today in modernity, they tend to think of humans as homo economicus, right? As sort of these rational, utility maximizing creatures, that humans are and ought to be rational. And I think what Girard's mimetic theory does best is to take the irrational parts of human nature and then provide them with a logic. So he's giving us the logic of the illogical side of human nature. So even though that there's a part of human nature, right, the mimetic side, that is not logical, that is not fully rational, there is still rules to it, right? There's still a logic by which it plays out. And it's the promise of being able to understand this hidden and more provocatively obscured part of human nature that was what really drove me to Girard, first to psychology, and then eventually his social theory, theology, and eschatology as well. So that was very much my into Girard. I have one more thing to say about the truth to power. So maybe I'll add that, even though you didn't ask. I can't remember if it was in this call or one of your pre-call emails. You mentioned how when these whistleblowers come to you, the first thing you tell them is that it's going to get a lot worse, right? And in some sense, that's quite comforting, because they know that you're honest with them. And I think Girard would very much say the similar thing. And the canonical example is really, for Girard, Jesus of Nazareth. Girard said that Jesus's sacredity is not a consequence of his martyrdom, but the cause of his martyrdom. And what Girard meant by that is that for all other religions, this is Girard's perspective, especially those pagan religions, the whole group, right? There's society's in turmoil. The whole group selects one victim to sort of put all the blame on, to scapegoat, and to expel, usually meaning murder, or at the very least exile. And then, because of this irrational, illogical, cathartic, spirited release, the community gets a lot better, right? To think Oedipus. And the community is trying to figure out what had happened, right? Who had given them all this benefit. And so paradoxically, they would say that it was the victim, the previous expelled victim, that was also the cause of its peace. And it would elevate this victim to a godlike status as being both good and bad, right? Having these two qualities. Now, obviously, this genealogical reading of pagan religion is a critique of pagan religion, right? To say that, look, the victim neither had the power, the victim wasn't responsible for causing the community's problems, but it also wasn't responsible for ending the problems. It was all psychological projection all the way down. So in this case, the sacrility, right, the sacredness of the victim is the consequence of their martyrdom. It's because they were sort of martyred and sacrificed that they become seen as sacred. Now for Christ, this is exactly reversed. Because he was sacred, this is sacred in a much more holy sense, right? He spoke truth to power. He was martyred. So he was killed because he spoke truth to power. And so perhaps, the first thing I'll say to this topic that you brought up, John, is that Girard will give somewhat of a pessimistic answer, but probably in line with your first response to these whistleblowers as well, is that it's going to get a lot worse. Because for Girard, worldly power, and you mentioned this as well about organizations like the UN being self-sustaining, for Girard, the essence of worldly power is grounded on deceit, grounded on lies and deceit, and that is what the essence of worldly power is, right? There's a reason that Girard says 3/4 of what he said had already been said in St. Augustine. It's because they all have a very pessimistic reading of worldly power and institutions. Even the best form of worldly institutions are deeply corrupt, deeply untruthful, and deeply deceitful. And so if you take the essence of the whistleblower to be speaking truth, then worldly powers, it needs to actively silence it to maintain itself.
One of the things I loved about your lecture series is how you introduced me to Girard the man, Rene Girard the man. And now Luc Hoebeke, as he will tell you, has been my mentor for 20 years. And one of the aphorisms which he gave me, he says, in life and in organizations and everything, there's no such thing as problems. There are only people with problems. Tell us a bit about Rene Girard, the person.
So if people are interested, my friend Cynthia Haven wrote a great biography of Girard called Evolution of Desire. And so I'm mostly going to be summarizing from that book. So he was born in France, I believe in the 20s. He was a college-age student during the Nazi occupation. His father was an archivist. And Girard always had a very pessimistic reading on war. I think because his father or his father's brother, I can't remember, served in World War I and he got injured. And it was just a very meaningless thing. And so the interesting thing about Girard's sort of 20s during the Nazi occupation was that, of course, he thought the Nazis were brutal, untruthful, scapegoating the Jews, obviously. But he saw a similar mode of issue with the French resistance after it came back to power and the Allies had sort of liberated France. So according to Girard's biographer, there was many movements in the French resistance that scapegoated women who had even the most tangentious affiliations with the Nazis. Now, some of these women perhaps had actively engaged in sexual relationships with them, but some of them had just cleaned their houses. And the French mob basically paraded these women and sometimes killed them. And so for Girard, I think that emphasized two things. One is the likeness of enemies, right? For Girard, the image in his head is always of what he calls the warring twin, right? This is a very biblical image, right? Cain and Abel. But he also uses as a lens to view historical conflict. For example, he takes China and America to be too similar, and that's why they're computing right now.
Russia and America, exactly the same.
Yeah, exactly. That was part of his formative journey. Girard then came to Indiana University, where he studied history, I believe. But the really curious thing about Girard is, given how he was a quite successful academic, he was essentially tenure at Stanford and was a part of the very prestigious Académie Française. He was actively hostile to the academy, in the sense that he got his PhD in history. He made almost little contributions there. The first important book he wrote was in literary theory, because he was forced to teach literature, and he came up with his own theory, Desire, Deceit, and the Novel. In fact, that is the only academic discipline now that I think take Girard seriously. It's comparative literature. The second book he wrote, people were expecting a continuation of this psychological literary analysis, was violence in the sacred, right? And that delved into anthropology. And so Girard is almost like a truck, if you will, an American monster truck that is sort of barging in on all these different disciplines, and perhaps that's why the academics do not welcome him. I think there's all other reasons more legitimate for why they're shunning Girard, but that must be one of them. And so Girard, I would say, is probably one of the least academics in the past century, because he would just barge into these academic disciplines wherever his intuition took him. And I think there's a Steve Jobs quote that he said in a Stanford graduation ceremony, that you can only connect the dots looking back. And so I think Girard, at the end of the day, looking back, he had built this really impressive and magnificent system spanning psychology and theology and with its own world history and eschatology. But I don't know if he had the intention of doing that. I felt like he was very much more of a prophet, or what I called him, an exeget, someone who had a tinge of inspiration instilled in him that he was just trying to explicate amongst these different disciplines. So for him, I don't think hopping between these different disciplines of psychology or anthropology or sociology, theology, were different tasks. It was this trying to expound this one core insight that I think he was sort of inspired with, really.
But Rebekah, what has been so helpful about his work to you?
I first encountered Girard maybe like 10 years or more ago, hearing about him through kind of the Catholic peace activist types. And I had read Walter Wink, and Wink references Girard. Really kind of I think has gotten me into him more recently is that my own history is one of, I grew up in a kind of right-wing fundamentalist Christianity. And when I was in my early 20s, I left that, and I eventually got into more progressive streams of Christianity, but also into social justice activism. And what has become very interesting and more apparent to me over the years is how much the sort of left and the right are in their own mimetic rivalry with one another, and especially seeing the way that played out in these very politicized versions of Christianity was quite interesting to me. And so I've been thinking a lot about the polarization that exists in our country right now, and also experiencing a lot of the problems that we would see in the activist or organizing circles. I have a lot of friends who are social movement theorists and like real trained as old school leftist organizers that have been trying to figure out how do we push the needle on some of these issues here in our country. And some of these older organizers are like, we don't understand what's going on right now with the left, with younger people, with the whole cancel culture. Like everyone's just becoming crazy. And Girard was someone who really started to explain a lot of these dynamics for me, not just the mimetic rivalry, which was something I had already intuited.
Can you just explain that a little bit for the benefit of newcomers?
Yeah.
Mimetic rivalry and mimesis.
Yeah, so mimesis is basically, you know, Girard says that we get our desires from other people, as Johnathan explained. We learn to want what our peers around us want. And the thing about it is mimesis is pretty much the foundation for language and culture. We can't exist without mimesis. We wouldn't be human without mimesis. Like we learn by copying one another, right? And so we learn to copy one another's desires in a way. A lot of times what you see happening, what Girard says is that we start to want what other people want, but because we're too similar to them, we have to find ways to differentiate ourselves from them because we're in this rivalry for this thing that we may not even understand what it is we really want. And so what I saw happening, say with like progressive Christians who are trying to differentiate themselves from, we're not like those bad, nasty right-wing, like those Republican Christians over there. So, you know, it's fascinating the way social media has amped up this process, because I would see this all the time. People would love posting memes about like, oh, those bad Christians, we're like the good kind that love Jesus, you know? And it was often it seems so facile and shallow to me, And I thought, well, this isn't really what faith or spirituality is about, just trying to score points on the opposition. So, and I realized what, it's this battle for being seen as who has a legitimate version of Christ, who has a legitimate version of the gospel. So that's one way that happens in the faith sphere. And I think it happens between the right and left generally. But the other thing that I thought was really fascinating was within activist spaces, which are often very secular. You will have some people that are people of faith, but even if they're explicitly faith-based spaces, are often operating on much more secularized principles. And so, because a lot of the organizers I know have really studied religious movements, because they are always trying to figure out, how do we engineer something that has the organizing power of, say, Rick Warren's Saddleback Church, which, if you don't know what that is, that's a huge mega church in Southern California. Rick Warren wrote this book called The Purpose-Driven Life. He has a whole system for how you organize people within a church, get them to work together and work on projects that, might benefit the community in some ways. It's actually quite an impressive organizing model. And I know people who have not Christian at all, who have pretended to convert and spent like 6 months going through all of the training programs and working their way up in that church, simply to learn, how does it work from the inside, and how can we replicate this in a political movement? So they're super fascinated with this stuff. They're also really fascinated with 12-step, because 12-step is an amazing decentralized organizing model that has, Alcoholics Anonymous and whatnot, that has managed to create a lot of change, amazing change in people's life. But what you see in the leftist organizing spaces that these people would try to create is they would just fall down. They would fall apart in this mess of recrimination and accusation and the cancel culture stuff and purity, what we call purity culture. Like, you're not committed enough, you're not left-wing enough, you're not anti-racist enough, you're not this or that, right? And it was studying Girard that made me realize, like, oh, what they're missing, that they have in 12-step and they have in, an evangelical church, what they're missing over here is the external mediator that kind of points people towards transcendence in the higher power, or in, Jesus, God. And I thought, oh, that's really, really interesting. So those are two ways in which it's illuminated some of my experiences that I've had. And I think the other thing that I'm really interested in is, because I have a background as a nurse and I've done, a lot of writing for health education and stuff like that, I really started thinking about, what is it that our spirit, and because I'm also a spiritual director, how is it that our spiritual practices actually work to help us become anti-mimetic, right? That's what Luke Burgess calls anti-mimetic, to sort of resist the unhealthy mimetic pools, right, that are going to entrain us into ideas and desires that aren't good for us. When you look at like the research on things like meditation and prayer, also psychedelics, the areas of the brain that are kind of being shut down are the same areas in those processes that are being diminished, are the same parts of the brain that are responsible for a lot of what we would call this mimesis. There's a lot of overlap with language learning areas. There are also the parts of the brain where we create these, what the neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett calls prediction loops, that shape how we experience reality. So these ideas that we get from other people about what we should want and what's going to happen, but they help us live in some ways, and that they help us shut out a lot of stimuli that would otherwise be overwhelming. But we get trapped in them. And so I'm still working through this, how to articulate it, but I think that there's something there to be said for the way that faith, religion, spirituality helps us to resist mimesis. Although it can also, of course, you can get into your own mimetic traps with that. But
I really resonated with what Rebekah said about cancel culture, and how Girard helped her illuminate or understand some of the more perverse elements of both the right and the left in modernity. And I think that was one of the most illuminating parts as well, Girard's commentary on modernity. And for him, the 20th century represents essentially the far right, Nazi totalitarian. For him, that's Satan, and that's satanic because Satan is the scapegoat mechanism, to put it succinctly. Satan is the worldly power, right? He's a prince in principalities. So Satan is in this conniving force in the shadows, lurking to destroy worldly institutions. For Girard, there's a really strong sense where Satan is the worldly institutions and is worldly power. Satan holds worldly power against truth and love. And, you know, the Nazis are satanic because they actively try to rebel against the protection of victims, right? That's one of the key messages, if you want to summarize, for Girard, the key messages coming out of Christ's crucifixion is the protection of victims. The Nazis obviously rebel against this message, right? And they want to actively bring back paganism and the persecution of victims, again, in the case of the Jews. Now, Girard thinks that Nazism and this sort of right totalitarianism, this satanic reactionary movement, no longer has any force in the 21st century. However, he does think that there's a much more dangerous threat, and that's what he would attribute to left-wing totalitarianism. So, like, think of Stalin, for example. And for Girard, and I think this goes back to cancel culture as well, left-wing totalitarianism is much more clever than right-wing totalitarianism. For Girard, left-wing totalitarianism is the Antichrist. Now, the Antichrist, unlike Satan, who directly opposes and wants to usurp the place of God, the Antichrist takes on the robe of Christ, right? He sits in the temple of Christ. He claims that he is Christ. So he takes on the appearance of Christ, but then he subverts him from the inside. And this is left-wing progressive totalitarian movements because they claim to protect victims as the way to persecute new victims, right? Girard's observation is that the only people you're allowed to persecute these days are the persecutors, right? You're allowed to persecute men in favor of women. You're allowed to persecute the whites in favor of the oppressed minorities. You're allowed to persecute the able-bodied and the fit in defense of the disabled. And so that was just a commentary of agreeing with Rebekah about how Girard helped me understand some of the perversities of the modern far right and modern far left.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. Thank you. And I'm now can't wait to hear what Luke has to say, because Luke, you're a twin. You're an identical twin, so you can speak of this. You know, how Girard talks about Cain and Abel and this kind of sameness and difference.
The fortunate thing to be a twin is that you are confronted, without you wanting it or knowing it, by mimesis. If people take one for another, because we are identical twins. My mother, at the end of her life, did not, in the phone, she did not know who was speaking. I or my brother. On site, we are different now, but that's thanks to the wives. But that made to me, and that's the learning, that competition, that kind of competition, I became blind for it, because I passed through that the whole time. Because if you have the whole time lived, I could not compete with my brother, because sometimes I didn't know if I was my brother or my brother was I. There was no sense to compete, and we abused also the fact of our similarities. There's to change places and so on. Thus, I became blind to competition, and that has been very helpful in my life. But then, and I mentioned that in my mail, when I started to be trained in group dynamics, because my background is engineering and computer. So in that sense, I'm a bit the same story as Johnathan said. But I was more and more interested, because I was developing systems in the 70s and so on. I was much more interested in the organizational issues, the people issues, how they give meaning, because in the whole information systems thinking, there is no place for meaning, while meaning is essential. But the only person giving meaning is the one reading and listening. The one saying something is as a seeding. Yeah? Communication is seeding, but the essence of meaning is the one who listens or the one who reads. Yeah? That's been very. But I came, to make it short, I saw the mechanism of Girard working in group dynamics in practice. Yeah? When a group was confronted with a task, because John said that my domain, yeah, that I created, I also created a domain, as Girard created his domain, which I call work system, yeah, is people being interdependent for achieving something. Yeah. When that achieving something becomes messed up, and that is where Girard comes in, when the society, he talks about society, but you can talk about groups, yeah, when they don't see clear what happens, then you see that mechanism coming up by appointing, and I'm mentioning about the concepts of Winfred Bion, who is one of the people who, in my opinion, by experience, his book is Experiences in Groups, yeah, not theory, but experience in group, who discovered how in that a leadership appears, yeah, which becomes, in fact, a scapegoat. A leadership of an as-if leader who is able, yeah, to deal with the situation while you need each other, but there is a projection towards this person, and there are three kinds of leaders. There's one leader who is the dependence leader, that one says, look at him, he will save us, yeah. That's one kind of leadership. The second is the fight-flight leader, yeah, with the external enemy. Yeah, thus we have to fight. One of the aphorisms that I made is, oh, there is no worse friend than the common enemy. Yeah. There's no worse friend than the common enemy. And that's where the fight-flight leader, which we see also in society, yeah, where the violence comes from. Yeah. Because when I was listening to you, Rebekah, about these groups, yeah, it's typically they are similar, yeah, they don't know what they are busy with, yeah, and that's why they are excommunicating each other. Yeah, excommunication is always a sign of an early church. Because it's a healthy phenomenon. Excommunication is a healthy phenomenon. Yeah? But okay, and that is then the fight-flight, and the third one is the messianic couple. That in the group there is the expectation of a messias coming, and there are persons who say, yeah, the messias is coming. The messias will never come, yeah? Because he's not. There is a very simple reason. If the conditions are there that he should come, yeah, it's not worthwhile that he comes. Yeah?
So if the conditions are favorable to the Messiah coming,
I mean, it's not worthwhile that he comes.
Not much point of him coming.
That's the whole messianic idea. I left it behind. I don't see Jesus as a messiah. Yeah. What you mentioned about, and that's essential for Girard, that he's not a scapegoat. In that sense, and because I have read Girard, one of the characteristics of the scapegoat is that he is appointed by the group as a scapegoat nearly at random. So if I read here in one of the texts, yeah, we have three types of representation that dovetail perfectly. I say intimations of a social crisis. That's essential. Intimation of a social crisis. And the attribution of something like an evil aid to some individual. But in his writings, he said this some individual many times is at random. Or is in my experience with groups, is an as-if leader, yeah, which is really at random. There are some characteristics, but they can shift from one to another in a rare time, yeah. And then the collective murder of the individual. Yeah, that are the three aspects. But the essence of it, and I think that's where Girard's ideas are very important, is the first part. If instead of that message, we listen to the indirect clues, the lynching of the victim will suggest a collective mechanism of projection that must be understood in reference not to the victim, of course, but to the unmanageable and incompletely formulated problems of that collective. Because that I found my understanding of that. Yeah, which creates that mechanism and so on. But, and I have a big but, and I said it to John, Girard is a systems thinker. Why is he a systems thinker? Because he looks at relations. That's essential on systems thinker, where the relations are more important than the parts of the relations. Yeah? And he looks for invariants. And that's why he's multidisciplinary. Yeah? That's why he found it everywhere. In that sense, he's a great system thinker, but he's not a systems practitioner. Once you are confronted with materiality, and thus I speak also in these groups, there was a materiality, there was a time spans, there was space to take into account, there was the other of one another, and so on. When that becomes the materiality saves us from the scapegoat. And the table, for me, is there the symbol and the meal. Thus, I'm working with groups. Yeah, the meal is essential to all the groups. And we begin with the meal or we end with the meal. Yeah? And everyone contributes to that meal. And there are quite discussions and quite differences, yeah, but there is no excommunication. There is no the good ones and the bad ones. Yeah? But then I have to stop there because I have a scientific background as an engineer. I have a religious background as a Catholic. When I was in South America, culture shock and so on, always interesting to live that, if you survive it, yeah, is the whole scientific thinking that was brought in is useless. It's useless in society. I'm an engineer, yeah, say I wanted to apply science in the practice. I say the methodologies we studied, yeah, as an engineer are completely useless to bring science in practice. That's one. Yeah. And I left the church, and the only thing that I could do at the moment was looking at the roots of science, the real roots, that is the writings of real scientists, not academic writings, but the writings of, for instance, Newton, of Pasteur. Yeah. And coincidence, but there are no coincidences, I came across someone who introduced me in the Hebrew Judaic tradition. And that was for me an eye-opener, because there, and it is not, Jesus was not a Christian. Christianity is something from the 2nd, 3rd century after Christ. Yeah? Paul was not a Christian. They were both Jews and they were completely embedded in the Jewish tradition. It's, I think, the change of the table to the altar, just going back to the pageantry, yeah, as I said on the friend Girard, is something because the church excommunicated Judaism. The Council of Trent, for me, yeah, is the end of Christianity, and that's why Protestantism, you know, and all these sects and all against the other and so on. Yeah, while I'm working with groups, working on the text, on the biblical texts. Yeah, there are atheists, there are Freemasons, there are Catholics, there are Jews, there are Islam, yeah? And we work together and we eat together. And there is no idea that one should convert to another one. The idea of conversion is contrary to the love for the neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah? You have not to convert him. And conversion is a signal where mimesis starts to appear. Yeah? Because the one must desire the same thing as you. And you create a violence. And that's what the history of the church is, a violent history.
And Luke, you learned Hebrew and you're writing a commentary in the book of Job. How far have you got, Luke? In the 20 years since I've known you, you've been still writing this.
No, I'm not writing. I'm working. I'm not writing because writing is a dangerous activity. Well, I know I wrote articles and so on, but I'm less and less inclined to write. Yeah, because writing doesn't signify anything. And you mentioned it by Girard. He's an exeget. In fact, reading is an important thing. If you want to convey something by writing, you do not convey anything. Yeah? The important thing is what the reader makes of what you have written. That's important. After 20 3 years. Yeah, I started in 2001, and now we are busy with chapter 24.
So,
Each month an evening. Yeah, each month an evening. Yeah, and that means one chapter per year. That's not trying to find what the writer wanted to. That's the classical exegesis. From where does that come? What did the writer want to say? It's not important at all. What does the text say to us? What are the different way of reading it? And that's a dialogue which is very enriching, and it is, in fact, becomes a spiritual dialogue. Each one has his desire as base, and not the desire of another. And there is nothing wrong with desire, yeah? Because, in fact, the only thing that has been created is desire.
Well, you're in for a treat if you want to read some of Luke's stuff, and I'll share it with you. Now, Johnathan, I'm dying to hear your response, because I love the fact that you speak of yourself as having spent time as a monk and having a different spiritual path and being very interested in Zen Buddhism, is it? I want to learn, as a cradle Catholic myself, who's been brought up from the word go in a particular patriarchal type tradition. And I've always found it so refreshing to learn and enrich my understanding of scriptures and all sorts of reality by hearing it from a perspective of somebody who's from the outside looking in.
I was actually brought up Protestant. So I went to church from a very young age. This was back in China, actually. I won't go into the whole story. But, you know, like many STEM-focused teenagers, I strayed away from the faith. And then I got reintroduced by Girard. But that, and to this day, has remained mostly a theoretical appreciation of Christianity, and not a sort of existential or a religious belief. Partially because I'm not that convinced by his claim of the uniqueness of Christianity. So I have experienced Christianity as both a practitioner, albeit a very young one and a very naive one, as well as a somewhat of a theoretician. And I've had the same exposure to Buddhism as well, where I was Colombia, where I studied, had one of the great Tibetan Buddhist professors and departments. And so I was also brought up in the Tibetan tradition, first theoretically. And then I spent a summer practicing in a Tibetan monastery in Nepal, mostly as a practitioner. It's a bit hard to define the boundaries between practitioner and theoretician, because it's not as clear as a sort of, was Christ resurrected, sort of what makes someone a Buddhist practitioner, so to speak. So I have experienced both traditions. In fact, I attempted to reconcile both in a book-length project that I pursued called Completing Girard. It's actually on my website. It's like a 50,000-word academic manuscript. And in that manuscript, what I attempted to do was show that how the Buddhists arrived at very similar insights to Girard about the nature of desire and how it can lead to the scapegoat mechanism. And I tried to transpose this Girardian triangle of mediation and then positive and negative mimesis onto this sort of Buddhist triangle of the three dukkhas, misknowledge leading to craving and then an aversion. Now, one curious consequence of doing this fundamental interfaith dialogue by showing how synergistic they are is to invalidate one of Girard's most important conclusions of Christianity's uniqueness, by showing that Buddhism had already had in its own way arrived at these understanding and conclusions as well. And maybe I'll just make one broader commentary. So this is one of my key struggles right now, where I'm pretty concerned about what's going to happen to me in the afterlife. Whether, I'm still agnostic right now, whether I just poof out of existence, or there's a heaven and hell as the Abrahamic faiths claim, or it's a Buddhist reincarnation, because there's very bad outcomes for all of them, right? Whether it's the Christian hell or it's one of the Buddhist hell realms. And so that sort of personal existential concern makes me really want to find the right faith, so to speak. But it's because I've been exposed to both Buddhism and Christianity almost equally, I would say, and I'm quite convinced of both. And I've often felt if I was a 17th century European and there was a choice between atheism and Christianity, the leap would be very easy. Or if I was a 15th century Chinese sort of person, and it was just between sort of agnosticism and Buddhism. It would be easy leap. But today in the globalist culture, and unfortunately, I think I've been exposed to too much of the two spiritual traditions I have explored. I've been, I wouldn't say equally convinced by both, but quite thoroughly convinced by both, and have no doubt that they're both coherent in their own terms. And when I look around of why people end up choosing the faith that they do, it's usually through a lot of these social forces, right? Because I was brought up in Catholicism, because this is my culture, and there are conversions, but all of this is making me quite despairing of being able to pick the right one, so to speak. And perhaps only a miracle can save me now. But and I'll just say one more point here, because Luke touched upon this idea of not like converting others and not converting others. I will say that they're all distinctly different, i.e., the easy way out, so to speak, of saying, oh, you know, all of these religions are leading you to the same truth. I think is quite clearly wrong. So I do think there's a right or wrong here, and an answer could be that none of us have it right. But anyways, that's just maybe more of a personal biographical point.
I found your sort of dilemma over which path is the right path and which is making the best truth claims to be really interesting, because I think one of the things that I've learned from studying Christian history just on my own over 20 years is, you know, certainly early Christianity is very diverse. In some ways, they are coming out of Judaism, as Luke says, but Paul is a Jew, but he's like a different kind of Jew than James and even Jesus would have been. He's coming from a little bit different context. He's not a Jerusalem Jew. He's more Romanized. He's more cosmopolitan in a lot of ways, and it's pretty clear like he wants to take. He seems to see Jesus as something, an innovation on Judaism, something that is beyond it, that then he can take to people who are not Jews and convert them into. And, you know, when it comes to conversion, I think I used to be really like, oh, conversion, it's so, why do you have to like convince people that you're right? And I get it. I myself have been part of a lot of ecumenical groups that I think are very rich and rewarding. At the same time, you know, if you're somebody who really thinks like I have something that can help people and I'm passionate about it, of course you want to evangelize to some extent. You want to say, hey, I think this, if you know someone who's an alcoholic and you went through AA, you might want to convert them to AA, right? So I have some experience with Buddhism as well as in Buddhist meditation, which I've found to be very helpful. I also practice something called centering prayer, which is a Christian form of meditation, but it was developed by Christian contemplative monks who were performing inner spiritual kind of dialogue and exchanging practices with Buddhist monks. And it was through some of these Christian monks sitting in Zen sesshin, they said, oh, this meditation that we're doing with the Buddhists, it actually gives us insight on what a lot of these classical Christian mystics were talking about, because now we understand they must have been doing something similar, even if they didn't have the precise methodology. So I think that you're right that Buddhism does sort of expose or get a lot of these insights about mimesis before Christianity does. There's a case to be made that certainly during that time period, there's a lot of exchange going on between the East and the West. It's not like people didn't know about what was going on in the East. So they very well may have been exposed to some Buddhist ideas and Buddhist practices. And when it comes to reincarnation, there were early Christians that believed in reincarnation. The doctrine of hell doesn't really get nailed down until much, much later in the Christian tradition. What I will say as someone who's been part of what we call inner spiritual spaces, is that this idea of inner spirituality comes from a couple places, but Thomas Keating, who is the priest and Cistercian monk who founded centering prayer, which is the meditation practice that I talked about, he was part of this network of spiritual practitioners across traditions that were really interested in what can we learn from one another. And he started something called the Snowmass Inner Spiritual Dialogues. And one of the things that they would talk about, you would have these long time Buddhist monks meditators, people who are very experienced in that tradition. They would have Jewish rabbis. They would have, these Christian monks and priests. They would get together and they would say, look, like, where do we have similarities? Like, where can we see the commonality and where are there differences? And what I would say is there are important framing differences that do qualitatively shape our experiences. So I think it's valuable to ask what is the right path, or maybe what is the right path for me. But what they also said was, like, we believe that these practices, not just the theological beliefs, but like the actual practices, are all leading us towards an experience of this transcendent reality that is beyond all of our conceptions of what the world is. And it's that experience that is the important part, right? So none of us really knows what happens in the afterlife. I myself lean towards some sort of reincarnation that leads towards an ultimate apokatastasis, which is a word that the ancient church fathers used to describe this idea that, as Julian of Norwich says, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, that in the end, everything is reconciled. Everything is brought into like right relationship. And for me, it makes sense to think, well, yeah, reincarnation, it makes sense that we might be living over and over again as we learn to grow into that apokatastatic vision, right? There were early Christian fathers that believed that kind of thing. So I always encourage people to go beyond just the doctrine and the schematic frameworks, which I don't think are not valuable. I think that those, we have to have these frameworks with which we shape our reality. But we also, and this is where I think this is what I'm talking about with anti-mimetic practice, like these spiritual practices in taking us to this place of perceiving a more transcendent reality, help us to go beyond the sort of programming, the mimetic programming that we carry with us. They help us to go beyond these frameworks that, we can't escape, but they help us to change our relationship to them and maybe see them in a new light and start to shift them in different directions. The other thing that I'm really interested in, I so resonated with what you said about the whole way that the left says, no, we are the real protectors of victims, right? And one of the problems I have with Girard, and it may be that I haven't read him enough to fully, understand his full thinking on this, but I can't remember where it is, but it's in some point where he's talking about Nietzsche, and he's really pushing back against Nietzsche's idea of like a victim mentality, right? And say, well, no, that's not true. And I'm like, right now, there's a lot of research out there that says people on the left are having, their mental health has plummeted, right? Like if you have leftist politics, you are much more likely to be depressed and anxious. And I absolutely think part of this is because what we've learned to do on the left in saying, like, we're always protecting the victims is, and the victims are the ones that should have power, is that, well, then the way I get power is to conceive of myself as a victim, right? That's how.
It's mimesis. It's another form of mimesis of Girard.
Yeah.
Mimesis, exactly. Yeah. Now we want to be the victims. Yeah.
Right.
And we want to copy the victims, which is it's exactly because it's the same mechanism for me. Yeah. Left and right, they have the same mechanism, and that's why Girard is very strong. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to say answer something because it's related to what Johnathan said. Essential. Yeah? You have not to choose your fate. You have to experiment your fate, and it is your fate. Fate is not a mental, it's not dogmatic. Yeah? Was Jesus God or not? It's not important at all. Yeah? Was he the Messiah or not? It's not important. It is, and that's what I said about group dynamics and so on. Our materiality, what we live through, and that's where meditation and so on is a very material activity. You are with your body. You are with your body, and your body says what fate you have. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But if I may ask a question there, my intuition is to push back against this idea that whether Jesus is God or not is unimportant. And so I'm curious if you can elaborate there. I mean, to me, it seems like, you know, as far as Christianity is concerned, like the real question, right? Even Paul said so himself. Paul said, you know, if Christ wasn't resurrected, what's the point of all of us? What's the point of us all of us being here? So it seems like it is incredibly important whether Jesus was the Messiah and whether he was the God and whether he was resurrected. But maybe maybe there's another perspective here.
I'm very interested in Paul because I also what Paul did and the greatness of Paul is that he opened up the Hebrew tradition for the not Hebrews. That is the strength of Paul, because he did not go to the pagans. He went from synagogue to synagogue. He went through small communities where people interested in the Hebrew tradition, but not converted to Judaism, he talked to them. And that's why all the discussion about the circumcision and so on can do it. But the idea that he was talking to the pagans, no, he was talking to people who were already interested in the Judaic tradition, but which were not Jews because their mother was not Jew, because that's much later, and they were not circumcised, because adult circumcising was quite a tricky thing in that time, and thus the greatness of Paul is that he opened up the Judaic tradition from the small ethnographic people of Judaism to the world. But once they forgot the Judaic tradition, Paul, and that's why we should go to the text in Greek, because I'm reading Paul about what he says about Christ and so on. There is no sign at all. First, the concept of Messiah is Christ. Messiah.
I'm sorry, I don't know. Did Luke just freeze or did he stop talking?
No, he froze. I think he's basically, he's probably coming back. He just had an outage.
Oh, okay.
Are you back, Luke?
I didn't want to interrupt him if he had something more to say.
Sorry.
It was Satan. No, what is called the church, were communities. And were Jewish communities. And that's why in Apocalypse, you have the 7 churches. There was no one church. When Peter is indicated as the boss of the church, and we have to read this text, it was nothing to do with the Church of Rome or with the Catholic Church. It was this community. James took over. Peter went to Rome, and James became the Pope because James was the decision maker in the first council, which was the Council of Jerusalem. But that's where the origins we have been. Christianity and Christian exegesis have sacrificed as a victim the whole Hebrew tradition.
Johnathan, I know you need to leave. What parting reflections do you have? And what do you need to advertise in terms of helping any of my viewers get a better sense of Rene Girard?
Yeah, well, that part is quite easy and self-congratulatory, I suppose. I would say that the first lecture that I did out of the 7 lecture series is supposed to be this gentle introduction to the, but also comprehensive introduction to Girard's framework. So that would be a great introduction for people who want to understand more about Girard. My friend Luke Burgess, whom Rebekah brought up, also wrote a book called Wanting, which is also very accessible. And in terms, if you want to read primary literature, I think if you want the most gentle introduction, I would start with When These Things Begin. It's like a conversation form, and he's asked a lot of things about contemporary politics and climate change and aliens and stuff like that. So it gives you a sense, I think, of the intuitions of mimetic theory. And then obviously you can always go the hard way, which is the way that I started, which is picking up things hidden, which is his sort of magnum opus in many ways. But I don't know. I wish I could have some more relevant things to say, especially on the South African situation. John, I know that was the sort of one of the themes of this conversation. But yeah, maybe I'll just, silence is better than saying anything in a domain that I have very little knowledge in.
Can I just give a shout out to you? Because what I found so helpful in your lectures, where you talked about how these mechanisms for dealing with mimetic conflict, how the law plays a very useful role, and then certain cultural practices. In South Africa at the moment, is our judiciary is the only thing holding us, and it has done something, but I'm very concerned. It's trembling on the edge, and that it's severe strain, and that with that goes, well, then we're only left with some new cultural practices that need to be evolved out of this to actually prevent that apocalyptic scenario that we all feared in the 80s, which didn't happen when we had our elections. So, but that is a conversation for another day. But I just want to say that's very helpful. Thank you so much. And Luke, you want to pull threads together? Thoughts?
Well, you have a very beautiful definition of full aphorism for hope stated. Hope is
believing in spite of the evidence and watching the evidence change.
Exactly. I mentioned it because, in fact, the original sin is anxiety. We live in a paranoiac world. There's all the signs in the States or in and just take care of that. And that's where the faith or the trust, the self-confidence out of your own experience, is the balancing against the distributed anxiety, which create Girard's mechanism. Anxiety, the society who is losing its direction and everything is possible. That's where Girard has found, take care of that. Where there is no more hierarchy, there is no more self-confidence, confidence in the other, engaging with the other. We have not talked about power. Power does not reside in someone. Power is a relation and an attribution. Mostly it is an attribution. The one who acts, the one who speaks, he has power. Not the one who theoretically is powerful. The powerful are powerless. I worked enough in multinationals to know that.
The whole paradox of it. Rebekah, do you want to say any parting thoughts and words?
Gosh, well, I want to, thank you for this, and I really enjoyed this conversation. It was, I'm sorry we couldn't speak more to the specific situation in South Africa, but I just want to say, Johnathan, like, I can so relate to your struggle, and I as someone who was raised Christian, and I've had a very fraught relationship with my own faith over the years. I've left it and come back many times. I've, for a long time, have said, well, I don't necessarily believe that Jesus is God, but it's like, whatever, it's a good thing to follow. Recently, I've been really kind of re-encountering Jesus and really coming to the conclusion that, I do believe that Jesus is God, but it's because it's been, as Luke says, I've been living it out in my materiality. Like you can't really decide that until like you live it out to some extent. It's not about making an intellectual assent. Now you do make choices about, I'm just going to follow this path even though I don't understand what it means, because I think there's something valuable in the practices and maybe it'll reveal itself to me over time. I know somebody who was on a Buddhist meditation retreat and had a revelation of Jesus, and that was how he came back to Christianity. So I think whichever path you choose, to me, it's about the practices and it's about continuing to wrestle with the questions and trust that whatever God is, that if you have an open and honest heart, it's going to reveal itself to you over time.
Let's hope we can stay in touch. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great day.